Hello, everyone. This PowerPoint is a review of planning and implementation in social work. This PowerPoint is a collaboration between myself, Dr. Janine Cross, and Nia Gibbs Francis. I'm a graduate assistant. Special thanks to Nia Gibbs Francis for her assistance and support and putting together this PowerPoint presentation for you. Any discussion of planning and implementation must first start with the client. In social work practice, we have a saying, start where the client is at. We start where the client is. And so any discussion of planning and implementation must first start with where the client is or where the client system is. And we start this PowerPoint presentation and discussion with client strength. Before we can even begin to develop a plan of action and implementation for a client, we first must understand the client and assess the client strengths. Assessing client strengths helps with developing the building blocks for an intervention plan. You want to make sure that the plan that you put in place and the interventions that you execute for that particular client make sure it draws upon and highlights the client's strengths. When you do an assessment of strengths for client, it helps develop a rapport. We talked earlier in this course about the importance of social work skills with individuals, particularly, but one of the skills is interviewing and observing. And so developing a rapport is key in that interviewing process and is a key skill for social work with individuals. But understanding client strengths help you develop a rapport with an individual, even in a committee or an organization, if it's a client system. Assessing client strengths also gives social workers an opportunity to provide feedback to clients, feedback about observations, insights about those strengths. Assessment of client strengths is also an opportunity for empowerment. Oftentimes, when clients present with problems, they are disempowered. Social workers oftentimes are working with marginalized and oppressed groups, and empowerment is key. And assessing client strengths is important in that process. It must be noted here that sometimes clients, depending on their frame of reference, may not have any identified strengths. And this is an opportunity for social workers to help clients identify their strengths or through skills of observation, point out strengths that you may see with a client. Also, assessing client strengths conveys dignity and respect of the client, which is an ethical value and standard. Ethics in social work that include social work values and standards are discussed earlier in this course. And there's also a video in which we discuss ethical values and standards for social work. Another key point with assessment of strengths is that it allows you the opportunity when you start developing your plan and intervention to align client strengths with the specific goals and objectives of the planning process. And we will go more into detail about objectives and goals later on in this presentation. So what is planning? When the client and social worker develop a plan with goals and objectives as to what needs to be done to address the problem, that is a plan. A plan is developed to help the client meet their needs or address the problem. It is in the second phase of the helping process. So again, what is planning? It is the work that is done at the beginning of the client social work relationship. It's the part of the process in which goals and objectives are developed, and those goals and objectives are directly aligned with the problem stated by the social worker and the client. Why is planning important? This step is important because it is the part of the helping process in which the social worker is working with the client to identify the goals of their time together. Oftentimes, this is done at the beginning phase So think about your intake when you're gathering information and conceptualizing a plan. During this time, the social worker also works with the client to analyze when they're going to be ready to make the change. You'll be learning more in the program about the change process and stages of change. The social worker's most important job during this phase is to help the client identify strengths and resources, not to make the client's goals for them. We will talk more about that in later on in this um, slide presentation. But again, important key step here is to understand that you are working for the client, but you're also working with the client. And the one important thing to assess during the planning process is the client's readiness for a change. There will be a model that you will be learning further on in the program called the stages of change model. We won't talk about it here, but it is a way of understanding where a client is in the change process, and it helps gives social workers important information on how to proceed with the client based on where they fall in the stage of change in the stages of change. Planning. Planning is collaborations with clients in the planning and implementation process. When you're collaborating and working with the client via an interview or a meeting, if it's a client system, the goal of the planning process, step one, is to prioritize the problem. The problem is the area in which you'll be planning to or planning for. And so the key is to make sure there's acknowledgement of the problem by the client. The client must have buy-in on the problem. Sometimes you can work with the client and what you see the problem to be and what they see the problem to be is different. But there needs to be an acknowledgement or a consensus of what the problem actually is. That problem must be clearly defined in understandable terms. It must be realistically solvable. It must reach a level of importance to the client. And that's part of the buy-in process because the client is key in the change process here. And the client is key in the action plan for the problem. And so it's important that they acknowledge it. It's important to them, and there's a buy-in in it. It's also important to frame the problem in behavioral terms. Again, as the client and the client system is the unit of focus, the problem has to be identified in some type of behavioral terms so that you can so that they can be worked on and you can develop action steps to address behaviors. And those action steps also will include the behavior. So framing the problem in behavioral terms, task terms, what can be done to improve outcomes. And it also integrates a mutually agreed upon problem in the service contract. So again, it must be mutually agreed upon, and this problem that you're identifying with the client will find its way into the actual service contract. So again, this is the collaboration process. And so you'll need to use your skills for working with individuals, um, skills for working with groups and organizations that you learned earlier on in this course to help you with the planning and implementation process because you'll be bringing those skills to bear in your work in generalist social work practice. How do you prioritize problems that are agreed upon between you and the client? One 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 concept or model to think about is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is a very good conceptual map that helps you understand how to meet the client's needs in a way that prioritize things that are important. Oftentimes, clients do not present with just one problem. There are several problems embedded in client issues. And sometimes they build off of each other, they reinforce each other, and sometimes they're cyclical. And so one way to look at it is in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological needs are the basic um, air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, physiological needs. if those earlier basic needs are not met, it's very hard to work on those higher level needs. And so the first priority would be to make sure the physiological needs of the client is met, that they have what they need to survive, feel secure, and be comfortable. So physiological needs, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction should be a priority. Priority number one. So if a client presents with any needs that fall within those areas, that should be worked on first so that you can work on the higher level needs. The second area is safety needs. Safety needs includes personal security, employment, resources, health, and property. And so once the physiological needs are met, now you're trying to determine, or if there are no physiological needs identified by the client, then you need to see if there are any safety needs that need to be met. That will be priority number two, making sure that client is safe. Again, personal security, employment, resources, health, property. Sometimes the personal security may be priority one, depending on the chronic nature of the personal security. If a client is really in danger, life, harm, families in danger, that may be priority number one. But usually, if somebody is homeless, they don't have a roof over their head or food. Usually, those type of needs will come first. But there, on occasion, it will be necessary to prioritize the safety needs first, if it relates to personal harm. So the next level of priority would be love and belonging, friendships, intimacy, family, sense of connection. Love and belonging will be the priority three. Please remember here that our NASW, our Social Work Code of Ethics, identifies the importance and focus on relationships. And so this priority needs identifies or highlights that standard of practice and value for the social work profession. Esteem, the next priority, priority four, would be respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and freedom. And so think about another ethical standard here in value, dignity and respect of the person. And so this is one of our practice standards. And so working on this priority needs is in alignment with our ethical duties and responsibilities and values as social workers. But when you think of esteem, respect, status, recognition, strength, and freedom, also think about some social justice issues. Social justice issues can find itself through physiological needs and safety needs as well. But when we think of status, recognition, strength, and freedom, think about rights of people of color, rights of immigrants. Think of racism, oppression, marginalization, and how those fit into self-esteem. Mental health also falls into self-esteem too. So does physiological safety needs and love and belonging. All those factor into your mental health as well. But esteem, respect, how a client feels about themselves, their status in life, how they're treated, their freedoms to be who they want to be, to explore life, to grow, all falls into the esteem area. And so working on client self-esteem would be a fourth priority. And self-actualization, desire to become the most that one can be. That will probably be priority number five. Or when you think about what steps you're working on first, or how you prioritize the problem, that will probably be one of the last things you work on. And the reason for these steps is that if you notice, these things, this can occur unless these occur. This can't occur until these occur. This can't be worked on effectively until these are met, and this can't be worked on effectively until this is met. So again, it's not that you can't identify these and work on them, but how much attention you want to provide and prioritize, earlier on should be on these levels first, and then you slowly work your way up. That's a good way to think about how to prioritize problems with clients. Another thing you need to consider here is that your agency may have limitations to how much of a priority you can work on, and that is okay. If your agency isn't set up to address physiological needs, safety needs, and then they still need to be worked on as a priority, you would just refer those out to professionals or community resources that can address those needs. And also be mindful in your planning and implementation that those referrals need to be in place and these things need to be worked on before you're able to really be as effective as you need to be as a social worker in these areas. So you have to be mindful of the limitations of your agency and which of these areas that your agency is set up to deal with. Another thing to think about is your agency may have its own process of how you prioritize needs of clients. And so in those situations, you should definitely use the agency process to prioritize as your representative of the agency bound by the policies. But conceptually, as you're developing your implementation and plan, you need to conceptualize the hierarchy of needs and how they play a role in how effective you'll be in the planning and implementation process. The phases of the helping process: phase one, phase two, phase three, based on overview of helping Hepworth book, identifies phase one, exploration, engagement, assessment, and planning; phase two, implementation and goal attainment; phase three, evaluation and termination. This is one model of the helping process. The textbook that we're using, Kirstashman and Hall, identifies the generalist intervention model, and we'll talk about that more further along in this presentation. So when you're thinking about the planning process, the two key areas you want to think about here are goals and objectives. Goals and objectives are what you use in the plan and implement service to clients. The goals are the outcome of the service plan. When you think about goals, they are your solutions to problems. Goals are broad and visionary statements. The goals creates directions for intervention. The goals evaluates interventions, and the goals aligns the agency and social work practice, policy, and standards. And goals are the why of what you're doing. Again, goals are the outcome of your service plan. When the client presents with the problems, the goals that are identified is this is when you're complete with your work. This is where you need to be, or this is what you're trying to achieve in broad terms. It will be the solutions to the problems that you've identified. They will be broad in nature and visionary. Where do you vision best case scenario the outcome to be for this client based on the problems that are presenting? And once you have a good idea of what those broad visionary goals are, and they're identified in specific statements, and then based on those goals and the statements, now you can start understanding the direction that you need to go to set your intervention. The goals will be something you revisit to see if the interventions were effective, and you're going to evaluate whether they worked based on whether the goals were achieved. Were they indeed solutions? Did the interventions you provide serve as solutions to the problem? And did you meet the goals, the stated goals? And so that will be how you evaluate the intervention. When you're thinking about the goals for your client, make sure that they align with social work practice standards, ethics, and values. You also need to make sure when you're developing the goals that they are for your client, that they align with the agency's goals as well. And again, when you think about the goals, or if you're looking at a document and you're not clear what the goals are, ask yourself why. Why are you doing what you're doing as a social worker with that client? Why are you doing what you're doing with the client for the agency? That's usually the broad visionary statements. The answer to that, and the answer to why is your broad visionary statement of the goal. Objectives. Objectives are your more specific behaviors and tasks that get you to the goal. They're the steps that are matched to the goals, and they are action statements rather than the broad and visionary statements. They are the tasks required to reach the goal. And so you'll usually have a goal listed broadly, and then underneath you'll have the objective, the steps needed to meet that goal. And sometimes you will see that there are steps within steps. So you'll have the goal, the broad goal at the top. You'll have an objective, the steps to get you to the goal, and there may also be sub steps needed for the objective as well. So an example of that would be, for example, a broad goal that I could have for myself is to complete the licensure exam or pass the licensure exam. One objective would probably be, I would list for that is study for the licensure. That would be an objective to that goal. A step underneath that objective would be to purchase the Association of Social Work Boards study guide. Take a professional development or a LEAP course for licensure. Will be a sub-step under that. That's an example of a step within a step. So under objectives, there may be sub-objectives for those objectives as well. And another thing to think about is your objectives are the who, what, when, where, and how. So because it's specific behaviors and tasks, they are matched to the goal, and their action statements. Those actions have to specify who is doing it. So on the example that I gave, the who would be me. The goal is that I want to pass the licensure. So the objective would be that I would need to study. So the who is me. Then when I talked about the objectives under that, I talked about purchasing the study guide materials and attending a LEAP course. That's who. The what would be the licensure prep materials. The what could be setting up a time, managing my time in order to study. Sorry, take that back. That would be the how I would go about meeting that goal. The what will probably be what I would need to study. Think about test prep materials. A practice exam probably would be the what. When would be where I choose to, when would be the time management of studying. Am I doing it in the morning times? Am I going to study on the weekends? Where would be the best place for me to study? Is it at home? Do I study at school where it's quiet? And the how would be the LEAP, using LEAP, the Association of Social Work Boards example. So again, when the planning phase requires you to really think critically and take time out to figure out who is doing it, what is needed, when does it need to happen, where does it need to have it happen, and how. And those, you'll find that you'll outline those in your objectives. Another example here would be your course syllabus. When you're thinking about planning and implementation, think about the start of this course and how early on we started off with reviewing the syllabus of the course. If you look in your syllabus, it talks about the goals and objectives for your learning. The goals are listed, and it talks about outcomes for this course, and then studies, and then the objectives, what students need to do, or what things will be done in the course to meet those goals. So again, your syllabus is another example of goals and objectives, and each of your courses will have those goals / outcomes listed, as well as the objectives. Also, when you think about your syllabus, think about it also as a service contract, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What is implementation? When the client and social worker execute a plan to address the areas of concern by completing the objectives to meet the goals. So again, when the client and social workers execute a plan to address the areas of concern, they do this by completing the objectives to meet the client's goals. The action phase is also considered a joint phase, as the social worker and the client act together, and they're working together collaboratively. The worker and the client begin to work on the tasks that were identified in the planning phase. Why is implementation important? This is part of the helping process, and it is important because this is what the client and social worker have been working towards. This is putting all the planning and work into action through a cohesive effort between the social worker and the client. The service contract is what we use to outline and clearly document the plan and the implementation process to occur for that plan. As I stated earlier, a good example of that for colleges and schools are your syllabus. Your syllabus is considered a service contract, and it includes everything that you need to be successful. And it actually is a plan written out to say that if when students complete this course, this is what they will. This is the outcomes. These are the objectives for the course. The goals. The assignments are the tasks, the specific tasks that need to be complete. The rubric is how we're going to evaluate and measure how you're doing and that you met the stated goals and objectives. And then ultimately you get your grade. But think about that, when you're thinking about planning and implementation and how it looks in different areas. And so in the education environment, that's what it looks like. But in your agency, it's going to look different. So the service contract is the service agreement between the social worker and client. It includes the goals, objectives, the service timeframes, and responsibilities. Remember, when we're talking about responsibilities, we're talking about the responsibilities of the client in the service contract and the responsibilities of the social worker in that contract and the responsibilities of the agency in that service contract. The social work duties integrate competence and skill. Remember, when you're listing what your responsibilities are in the service contract, it should also include that your competencies in your abilities to meet the needs of the client. And so our ethical standards, our NASW ethical standards talks about competence and skills required in social work practice. So for instance, if you're providing work as an intern, student intern, your credentials, right, your competency is as an intern and a student. That means in an MSW program, that means your competence is you at least have some kind of undergraduate degree to be an intern. So in order to be an intern in this program, you have to have an undergraduate degree. So your duties and competencies in the field is as a student. You don't have your master's yet. And so you're making sure that when you're saying this is my responsibility to the client as a student, those responsibilities are aligned with an intern. You want to make sure that the responsibilities that you're outlining is not of a licensed clinical social worker or a licensed social worker. If there are duties that fall under a licensed social worker, then the licensed social worker needs to do it. Or there needs to be some kind of discussion or mention in the plan that you're carrying out the duties under the supervision of, so that competency is being met. And so the key here is to make sure when you're outlining your responsibilities that you have the competency, the skills, and the knowledge, the education skills in order to perform the duties. That needs to be clearly outlined in the contract. Sometimes you'll see language such as a BSW social worker will do assessments, or an MSW social worker will do clinical evaluations. You'll see it listed that way. So again, making sure that competency and skills, if you're outlining that you're doing models of practice, for example, if a social worker is saying that they in their service contract that they're offering CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, then the person responsible needs to be a licensed clinical social worker, LCSW, for example. Student interns should not be saying, part of the service contract is to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy, and that will be done by me, the intern. That doesn't align up. So you need to make sure when you're outlining the service plan that the interventions are clear and the competency level of the person delivering the intervention is clear. Same holds true with the client. If you're saying the client is responsible for A, B, and C, you need to make sure that in your assessment of the client, which should follow through, which should identify the problems and the goals and the strengths, mind you, of the client, you want to make sure that the responsibilities are deliverable by the client. So if you know that there are areas that the client needs to work on, you may not want to give them a responsibility in an area that they do not have the competency to complete. That will be setting a client up for failure, or to not be able to reach said goals and or objectives. Okay. So just make sure when you're writing out those service contracts that you make sure you meet the competency needs of the objectives, and that the client can meet the needs of the objectives as well. So assessment of problem and interventions are clearly written. Who will be doing that, and their competency level should be discussed. The agreement includes informed consent with written agreement. Most agencies have a formalized process in which agreement for services can and should occur. Please remember that this is our ethical duties and responsibility of clients to have informed consent, and it's a way to value and protect clients in our work with them. Once the service contract is signed and completed by a client with informed consent, it is considered a live document. Usually that informed consent is signed by you, the social worker, and the client. And once that signature is there and the date listed, it is a live document. It's used for follow-up to see how well the client is progressing, and evaluation whether the intervention of the intervention you put in place, if it was effective. It's also used to evaluate your productivity and the quality of your work and your competencies with clients. Because if you're saying you're competent to deliver these services and the services did not occur or the client didn't meet the goal, it may have implications to the quality of your work and quality of your services. Or it may speak to areas of professional development, supervision, and training that you may need also. So if a service contract is revisited and you are struggling with meeting the client needs, the result of that evaluation may be to transfer that client to another agency where that's better equipped with the capacity to meet the needs of the client. It may be that another worker on the team who's more seasoned needs to take over the case to help the client meet their needs. And or it may help you see, or the agency see, that you need additional support and training in certain areas to help you move clients along more successfully. So again, the service contract is a live document and it's used for many purposes. So another intervention model that I want you to use and think about, but use heavily in your discussions here, is from your textbook, Kirst Ashman and Hole, Foundation for Generalist Practice. It talks about in your Understanding Generalist Practice book, it talks about the generalist intervention model as engagement, assessment, planning, implementation, evaluation, termination, follow-up. Then under follow-up, there's reassess and then termination. And I want to talk a little bit about that. The generalist intervention model covers these areas. Earlier on in the PowerPoint, I talked about the helping process, which is another model, which incorporates elements of the generalist intervention model. But for the purpose of this class and this course, the go-to model that I need you to refer to, as it's listed in your textbook, is the generalist intervention model. And so again, the foundation for generalist practice includes engagement, how we interact with our clients, how we engage with them, and bringing in those skills, those social work skills of individual groups and organizations in the engagement process. The next step in the generalist intervention model, before I go to assessment, engagement also includes the values and standards of practice that we talk about as social workers: dignity and respect of the client, right, or client system. We're also thinking about social justice issues when we're talking about engagement, how we interact. We also want to make sure engagement is culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate, culturally competent, and also making sure we display cultural humility as well. And so the assessment process. The assessment process is the next step in the generalist intervention model. We have plenty of methods of assessment. A gold standard is biopsychosocial assessments, or biopsychosocial spiritual assessments. It's a a key assessment tool that we use in social work, and it covers broad areas and it's very comprehensive. However, at your individual agency, they may have their own assessment process in which you are to use. Conceptualize the biopsychosocial assessment while you're completing the assessment of the agent, your assessment agency. You will find that a lot of agencies borrow from the biopsychosocial assessment as well. So your assessment is your gathering of key data from your client to help conceptualize the problem. But you're not only assessing what the problem is, you're also assessing client strengths, environment, resources, etc. And you're also assessing the client systems as well. So we also bring systems theory into play when we talk about assessments. But that is the next steps in the generalist intervention models, assessing the problem and assessing the resources and the client's capacity. Once you assess, you can then develop the plan we talked about earlier on in the PowerPoint, and then what implementation looks like. Implementation is the skills, the interventions that you're going to put in place to address the problems identified in the assessment. And that planning process is clear. It's clearly outlined and includes your goals and objectives, as well as your intervention. And then at that point, you use the policies of your agency and the NASW or social work standards of practice to move forward in your implementation of interventions. Once you are complete working with your interventions with the client, you then want to go back and evaluate using the contract. You want to evaluate to see if the problems that you were identified in the assessment were addressed by the intervention. If not, you have to go back and look at the intervention and see if it was correct. See if you may need to use another intervention to try to move the client forward or solve the problems or have the outcomes you're looking for. Evaluation may mean that the intervention was correct. There's challenges in the client system. You may identify that the client didn't meet their responsibilities, didn't execute their part of the plan correctly. It could be that you evaluate, you find out resources were not there. Your evaluation may uncover there's something you didn't do. There was a flaw that occurred in your responsibilities to the client. That doesn't necessarily mean it was a fault of your own. It could be, but it could be a system, something wrong with something that occurred in the agency, or you didn't have the tools that you needed from the agency. And so the evaluation may restructure the plan, and that restructure can mean continue the intervention with the tools and document why it didn't happen because you didn't have the tools. It may be documenting that the client didn't have the resources and support, and then you can modify the plan to continue, but adding the resources needed for the client. Your evaluation may decide you're not the person to do this and refer to a seasoned person, or the agency doesn't have the capacity to move the client forward. And so then the referral needs to occur to another agency. And again, so the evaluation is key because it helps you decide where there needs to be areas of improvement. Evaluation makes sure that you are more effective or the agency is more effective servicing clients moving forward. And or putting systems or mechanisms in place that will help you address clients and situations when the agency doesn't have the capacity. And then at that point, termination occurs. Termination can occur because you refer the client to another worker in your agency, so that termination stops with you. If a client needs to be referred to another agency, then the termination will occur with the agency. And termination is decided if the goals are complete and your work is done, or the goals are not complete and more work needs to be done with another person or another agency, and then transferring that care off to that agency and making sure that handoff occurs, which is an ethical duty, a standard and of ethical practice. We have to hand off to make sure the client's needs are met. And sometimes follow-up is needed. Follow-up to make sure either the transfer or the referral occurred and the handoff happened and is complete, or you complete stated goals with the client and you're following up to make sure that those goals are continuing and that the client is continuing to be successful in their outcome. Follow-up again may require reassessment or termination depending on what the follow-up reveals. If you follow up with the client and find out they've had setback, you have to reassess and maybe plan again. You may have to, when you follow up with the client and see that they're doing well, they continue to do okay, then termination continues. You reassess with client and find out that they have new problems, and then you start the assessment, planning, and implementation phase again, based on the policies of your agency. So examples of implementation at the micro level, and for time, I'm going to run through this quick. Planning and implementation. Working one-on-one with a client to plan out how they will create a healthier lifestyle. Working with the client to state the goal or outcome they wish to achieve. At the end of the session, it is decided their goal is to go to the gym 5 times a week for an hour and quit smoking by November 10th, 2020. The client begins to go to the gym 3 times a week is your implementation for 30 minutes, then builds up 60 minutes for 3 times a week. The client begins using a nicotine patch and cutting down the amount of cigarettes they smoke each day. So working on one-on-one with a client to plan out how they would create a healthier lifestyle. That's the goal. The objectives is the client begins to go to the gym. The gym is the where. The who is the client. 3 times a week. What and when is the and how. The client begins using a nicotine patch is the what, and cutting down the amount of cigarettes they smoke each day. That's the how. Next, and that was an example at the micro level. Examples at the meso level. Planning. The community members want to have fresh, nutritious, and affordable food, so the community decides to build a community garden. They plan out the location, leaders, gardeners, what will be planned, and when it will be harvested. The plan to have it started by April 2020. Again, the community members want to have fresh, nutritious food, and that's the planning. Implementation. In April 2020, breaking ground on the land for the community garden, planting foods and keeping the garden running, harvesting the community garden for the food and using the food to provide nutritious food for the community. Community members leading the charge, tending and running the garden. So the broad goal. The goal is the community members want to have fresh, nutritious, and affordable food. That is the goal. Who? Who is the community? The community that will be building the community garden. That is the who. How? By building the community garden. Breaking the ground for the community garden is the how. What? Planting foods, keeping the garden running. Harvesting the community garden for food and using the food to provide nutritious is the how and the what for the community. Community members leading the charge, who. Tending and running the garden, how. April 22 is the when. Okay. Examples at the macro level. Working with state officials to create programming to lessen the rates of death by drunk driving, DUIs, and drunk driving overall. That's the goal. It is decided the goal is to create a safer driving environment for Tennesseans. So the broader goal is to improve safe driving environment in Tennessee by working with state officials to create programming. That's the goal. You want to reduce the rates of drunk driving by 15%. That's an objective by September 2021. That's the win through the programming. So implementation, the social workers and state officials work to create an effective program based on best practice and existing literature. The who, social workers and state officials. How, evidence-based practice and existing literature. And a statewide program. The statewide program using best practice and existing literature is the how. Okay, or what? No, it's the what. The program is the what, excuse me, and you're using best practice and existing literature for the what. A statewide program and policy comes to fruition that keys must be turned in before someone begins drinking is the how. A breathalyzer, how. Tests must be conducted before they are permitted to leave. If it is over the legal limit, a volunteer who is designated driver will pick up the person. So let me say that again. The social workers and state officials are the who. Create an effective program based on best practice and existing literature is what. So the program is the what, but in that program you're using best practices and existing literature, which it falls under the what, but it's how. How are you creating the program with best practice and existing literature? And the statewide program and policy comes to fruition. An objective is the keys must be turned in before someone begins drinking. That's how, and you can measure that. A breathalyzer test, that's another objective. Breathalyzer test being performed, right? That's how you're going back about it, and you can measure how many breathalyzer tests were taken. And if it is over legal limit, a volunteer is designated a driver. That is a who. So these are all the who. So be mindful of who will be performing what duties in your plan. And when I see here where it says reducing drunk driving rates by 15%, that is an objective. And the when is September 2021. So again, I would like for you to use this skill. It takes time and it takes critical thinking to look at how things are developed, because in these examples it's not always clearly listed, and sometimes in your agency documents it won't always be listed. This is a goal, this is an objective. There are some agencies that have very have clear outlined missions, objectives for the agencies and goals. But then when you're actually creating the plans, the implementation, the planning and implementation for client systems, you then will need to do the same thing, come up with the goals, the objectives, and make sure you can clearly outline them. Or if you're reviewing documents that already have goals listed, you as the social workers need to be able to comb out the goals and comb out the objectives so that you know what are the broader visionary statements, what are the objectives, which are the details, the who, what, and when, right? You also want to be able to make sure that those objectives are measurable so that when you evaluate it, you also need to be able to extrapolate that. And the other thing is you need to make sure that when you're looking at plans and implementation, and that you're looking at the mission and the goals, or the goals and the objectives, that they're aligned with the agency's goals and mission as well. There has to be alignment there. You're also looking critically to make sure that the agency goals and objectives, or the agency mission and objectives, are aligned with social work standards of practice. And then when you go back and look at the planning and implementation for the client or the client system, again, you want to make sure that they're aligned with your social work standards of ethics and practice. And so the reference for this PowerPoint is our required textbook, and Johnson and Yanka, Social Work Practice, a Generalist Practice Approach, 10th edition. I hope this PowerPoint video helps review the key areas that we are covering this week on planning and implementation. Thank you very much for your time.